December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent under a thick blanket of snow, the pine trees weighed down with ice, masking the subtle movements of thousands of German troops preparing for a winter offensive. The American forces, spread thin along a seemingly quiet front, huddled in foxholes and small villages, unaware that the calm was about to shatter in a torrent of fire, smoke, and steel. Under the cover of darkness, German columns advanced cautiously. Panzer IVs and Tigers rumbled along narrow forest roads, their treads crunching snow and leaving deep tracks behind. Infantry followed, camouflaged against the white landscape, each man carrying weapons, ammunition, and the weight of a desperate gamble. The objective was clear: punch through the thinly held U.S. lines, seize key road junctions, and push Allied forces back to disrupt their advance into Germany. Artillery units waited in concealed hollows, ready to unleash devastating barrages on unsuspecting villages and crossroads. As dawn approached, flares and pre-registered fire zones lit the frozen landscape. The first shells crashed into forward U.S. positions, sending plumes of snow, earth, and debris into the air. The silence was gone. The thunder of German armor, the scream of artillery, and the rattle of machine guns filled the forest. American troops scrambled to respond. Foxholes became defensive fortresses, machine guns swept frozen fields, rifles cracked, and mortars were fired in rapid succession. Units that had expected a quiet winter morning were suddenly plunged into chaos, reacting with training, instinct, and sheer survival. Communications faltered under fire, yet officers attempted to organize squads, coordinate artillery support, and hold strategic positions. The Germans advanced relentlessly, exploiting every weak point. Infantry squads infiltrated through snow-covered woods, flanking isolated American units. Tanks moved in close support, firing shells into defensive positions and creating confusion among the defenders. Every street, village, and crossroads became a battlefield. Snow-soaked uniforms and frozen fingers did not slow the fighting. Desperation and determination fueled every soldier's actions. Meanwhile, the American artillery responded, targeting the German columns before they could consolidate. Shells tore through frozen forests, uprooting trees, creating barriers of wood and earth, and slowing the advance. Yet German commanders anticipated these countermeasures, dispersing columns and using smoke to obscure movement, maintaining momentum toward key objectives. Air support, limited by heavy winter weather, attempted to provide reconnaissance and occasional strikes. Low-hanging clouds and icy winds grounded many aircraft, making the forested terrain an advantage for the Germans. The skies were dark and threatening, but the ground war raged with lethal intensity. Every movement of men and machines was scrutinized, calculated, and met with immediate response from the opposing side. In the villages near the front, small American detachments prepared improvised defenses. Furniture, vehicles, and snowbanks became barricades, houses turned into strongpoints. Soldiers dug trenches and set up machine gun nests, aware that the German advance could overwhelm them if held improperly. The stakes were clear. Holding the first line was vital to prevent a domino effect across the Ardennes, which could jeopardize the wider Allied front in Western Europe. By late morning, the battle lines had solidified. German forces pushed forward with methodical precision, while American units dug in to hold villages and road junctions. Tanks exchanged fire across frozen fields. Infantry engaged in close-quarters combat within destroyed buildings. Smoke and dust blurred the winter morning, making every shot a gamble, every movement a risk. Artillery, mortars, tanks, and rifles combined in a deadly symphony of modern warfare. Snow was churned into slush by tank treads, buildings were reduced to skeletal frames, and streets ran with mud and blood. Soldiers on both sides adapted constantly, moving stealthily, coordinating fire, and exploiting terrain to gain advantage. As night fell, the forests of Ardennes were scarred but not conquered. The Germans had gained ground, pushing American lines back in some sectors, while other positions held firm under relentless pressure. The stage was set for a brutal winter battle, one that would test the endurance, courage, and tactical skill of every soldier involved. Operation Watch on the Ardennes had begun. What was supposed to be a quiet sector turned into a frozen battlefield, a deadly chessboard where tanks, artillery, and infantry would clash with ferocity unseen in the winter months. For the men on the front lines, survival, coordination, and sheer determination were the only things that mattered as the Battle of the Bulge had erupted in full force. The early morning haze clung to the frozen Ardennes as the second wave of the German offensive rolled forward with crushing force. What began as scattered artillery strikes in Part 1 erupted into a sustained barrage that shook entire ridgelines. Shells detonated with deafening cracks, flinging snow, splintered wood, and jagged metal across American foxholes. Men ducked, covered their helmets, and prayed the next round would not land directly on top of them. By dawn, the first American defensive positions were already cracking under the pressure. German infantry surged through the woods in coordinated waves. Their gray winter smocks blended with the icy white surroundings, making them nearly invisible until they were close enough for rifle fire. Machine guns opened up, sweeping through tree lines and suppressing U.S. strongpoints. The crack of Kar 98ks echoed between the pines, accompanied by the deeper thumps of Panzerfaust and mortar fire. Snowbanks turned into deadly cover as small squads advanced, firing, moving, and exploiting any gap in the American defenses. In the village of La Chimmergraben, the fighting intensified rapidly. U.S. outposts, manned by engineers and Green Infantry divisions, were never meant to withstand a major offensive. Houses shook under the impact of German explosive rounds. Walls collapsed inward, sending clouds of dust and debris into the streets. American soldiers held desperately, firing from windows, kneeling behind overturned tables, and darting between ruined doorframes to avoid incoming fire. Every building became a fortress, every street a contested battleground. German tanks soon appeared on the outskirts, Panthers and Panzer IVs emerging like steel beasts from the tree line. Their engines growled in the cold morning air as they advanced across open fields, plowing through snow drifts. Their cannons thundered, blasting apart American machine gun nests and demolishing improvised barricades. The flash of each shell lit up the frost-covered ground, followed by an eruption of splintered wood, brick, and flame. American Sherman crews scrambled to reposition, knowing that a frontal duel meant certain destruction. Yet despite being outgunned, U.S. crews fought back. Muzzle flashes appeared from behind barns, hedgerows, and snow-covered ridges. Shermans fired smoke shells to obscure their movement, maneuvering to hit German tanks from the side. Armor-piercing rounds clanged harmlessly off the sloped armor of Panthers, but every shot bought precious seconds for infantry to relocate or regroup. Tank destroyer crews, operating M10s, moved with careful precision, searching for flank opportunities. Each engagement was a gamble. One mistake meant a burning wreck, and in the Ardennes cold, surviving outside a tank could be just as deadly as the battle itself. Meanwhile, German infantry infiltrated behind the first line of U.S. positions. Moving silently through woods, they cut communication wires, ambushed supply jeeps, and encircled platoons before they realized they were isolated. Snow muffled footsteps but sharpened echoes of combat. Rifle shots snapped through the air, grenades detonated with muffled thumps, and shouted commands blended into the chaos. Small American squads found themselves surrounded, forced to hold crossroads, farmhouses, and bridges with dwindling ammunition. As the fight wore on, blinding snowstorms swept across the battlefield. Visibility dropped to mere meters. Soldiers strained to see silhouettes emerging from the white curtain. Vehicles slipped in icy ditches, men froze their hands to rifle triggers, and even the simplest movements became exhausting. The Ardennes, already a natural fortress, became an unforgiving enemy itself. Wind carried ice like needles, biting exposed skin, numbing fingers, and stiffening clothing. The weather grounded Allied air support completely. Thunderbolts and Mustangs remained stuck on runways, unable to take off. The Germans used the storm as cover to push deeper into American territory. At crucial road junctions such as Manderfeld and AUW, American units formed defensive rings. Machine guns positioned at key angles created kill zones. Bazooka teams lay in wait behind snowbanks, their breath barely visible in the freezing air. Every shot had to count. German armored personnel carriers approached through the storm, infantry dismounting and spreading out in assault formations. Grenades exploded in trenches. Rifles snapped with muzzle flare visible for only an instant before vanishing into snow and smoke. Reinforcements attempted to reach these encircled units, but every road was under fire. Jeep convoys raced along icy paths, dodging falling trees and artillery craters. Medics fought against time, dragging wounded soldiers through snow while shells burst around them. The wounded shivered violently, winter cold amplifying every injury. Blood quickly froze into dark patches against white snow. In villages further west, civilians hid in basements, while the thunder of war swept closer. The ground trembled with each tank shell. Houses burned through the night, their flames casting haunting orange glows against the snow-covered streets. The battle expanded like a storm front, swallowing one village after another. American command attempted to coordinate countermeasures. Officers radioed for reinforcements, repositioning artillery and preparing fallback lines. The situation was chaotic, with units reporting heavy losses and some sectors going completely silent. But despite the overwhelming German pressure, American resolve hardened. Small groups held crossroads longer than expected, forcing German columns to slow and consolidate. Every minute gained was vital for bringing up reinforcements and stabilizing the front. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again. The slow descent of winter night promised even colder temperatures and even more difficult fighting. Yet neither side withdrew. Tracer fire streaked through the darkness, illuminating snow flurries. Tank engines growled in the distance. The forest echoed with the metallic clatter of machine guns. The first day of the offensive had shattered the calm of the Ardennes, and revealed the brutal scale of what was coming. The Battle of the Bulge was no longer just an attack. It was a full-scale struggle for control of the Western Front, one that would push both armies to their limits. The forest fell eerily silent as the third day of the German onslaught arrived. Fresh snow, crisp and untouched, buried the wrecks of yesterday's fighting, burned out half-tracks, shattered Sherman hulls, and the frozen outlines of foxholes where American soldiers had fought until their rifle bolts seized from the cold. The Ardennes had become a white graveyard, and the men defending it were painfully aware that the worst might still lie ahead. To the north, the 2nd Panzer Division's vanguard continued to push west, their engines struggling to turn over in the frigid air. German officers shouted at mechanics, demanding impossible miracles from machines that froze as easily as men. Yet the orders were clear: break through, reach the Meuse, split the Allied front. Every minute lost was a minute the Americans used to regroup. Inside a battered command post, a Belgian farmhouse with its windows blown out, Major Robert Collins studied the map lit by a trembling lantern. Red arrows showing the German advance cut deep into Allied lines. He knew his unit was outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously low on fuel. Still, withdrawal wasn't an option. This narrow forest road behind them was the last route open for thousands of civilians, and Collins wasn't going to be the officer who let the enemy break through it. Outside, American artillerymen scraped ice off the breech of a 105 mm howitzer with their bare hands. One muttered curses through chattering teeth, another stamped his boots just to feel them again. Their breath thickened in the air like smoke. A forward observer's voice crackled through the radio. "Enemy armor, East Trelane, estimate 2 platoons. They're moving." The crews snapped to action. Fuses were set. Shells loaded. The gun barked, recoiling violently, and for a moment the surrounding snowfall glittered in the muzzle flash like shattered glass. In the forest, German grenadiers dropped into the snow as the shells began to fall. Branches broke. Trees splintered. The ground shook. But their officers shouted them forward, determined to reach the American lines before dusk. Then, from a ridge overlooking the valley, a formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts slashed through the icy wind. The pilots had found a brief break in the clouds, finally able to provide the air support that had been grounded for days by the blizzard. They spotted the German armor below. Targets confirmed. Rolling in. The valley erupted. Rockets streaked downward, explosions rippling through the columns of tanks. Flames rose against the snow like orange pillars, lighting the trees with a hellish glow. Back at the farmhouse, the radio man looked up, a rare smile spreading across his frostbitten face. "Air support's finally here, sir." Major Collins didn't smile. He was too tired for that, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "Good. Maybe now we hold this line." But he knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The Germans were desperate, determined, and still advancing through the forested maze of the Ardennes. And as night fell again, the temperature plunged even further, turning every breath into ice and every step into agony. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. Darkness dropped over the Ardennes like a heavy curtain, swallowing the landscape in a chilling stillness. The snow reflected nothing now, the moon hid behind thick clouds, and the only light came from distant fires still burning in shattered villages. For both sides, the night meant danger, because in the Bulge, night belonged to those willing to move silently, strike quickly, and vanish just as fast. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, blankets frozen stiff, rifles resting across their chests like extensions of their bodies. Frost clung to their eyebrows. Gloves had turned into icy shells. Every breath hurt. But they stayed awake, listening. The forest creaked. Trees groaned under the weight of snow. Somewhere in the distance, a single rifle cracked. Then silence again. Sergeant Lewis walked the line with slow, deliberate steps. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. His men were exhausted, their morale worn thin by the cold and the constant fear of German infiltration. Rumors of enemy soldiers disguised as Americans had spread through the ranks, making every shadow suspicious, every movement a potential threat. At 1:17 hours, the radio sputtered to life. "Movement detected near the river crossing. Possibly armored." Lewis froze. The river crossing was the weak point of their defense. If the Germans pushed through there, they would unravel the entire flank. "Get the bazooka team ready," Lewis whispered, his voice a thin cloud in the frozen air. Down by the crossing, Corporal Mendez and Private Dawson crawled into position, dragging the heavy launcher behind them. They pressed their bodies into the snow, waiting, listening. Then they heard it, a low mechanical rumble, muffled by the trees but unmistakable. A tank. It moved slowly, treads crunching over ice. Its dark shape appeared between the pines, the massive gun barrel sweeping left and right like a predator sniffing for prey. Behind it, German infantry advanced in staggered formation, silent and disciplined, their breath fogging the air. Mendez tapped Dawson's shoulder. "Hold, hold." The tank inched forward, closer to the log barricade the Americans had set earlier. Snowflakes drifted in the glow of its headlights. "Now!" The roar of the bazooka shattered the night. The rocket streaked across the clearing, striking the tank's frontal armor with a blazing flash. The machine jerked violently, smoke bursting from its engine compartment. German grenadiers scattered, shouting in confusion. From the ridgeline, American machine guns opened up, tracers slicing through the darkness like fiery threads. The forest erupted with muzzle flashes. Shouts echoed. Snow exploded into clouds as bullets tore into the ground. The Germans retaliated immediately. Mortars whistled overhead, crashing into the woodland. Trees splintered, branches fell, debris rained from above. The night became chaos, blinding flashes, booming impacts, the screams of wounded men drowning beneath the storm of gunfire. Sergeant Lewis sprinted through the trench, shouting orders. "Hold the crossing! Don't let them through!" The Americans fought with desperate determination. The Germans pressed hard, trying to break the line before dawn brought Allied aircraft. But minute by minute, the attack faltered. The disabled tank burned, illuminating the clearing with a flickering orange glow. German soldiers pulled back, dragging their wounded, disappearing into the forest that had swallowed them hours earlier. The surviving Americans sagged with exhaustion, collapsing behind their rifles. Lewis looked at the burning tank and exhaled shakily. "That's one night down," he muttered. "God knows how many more to go." For now, the line held. But dawn would bring new battles, and the full fury of the Ardennes winter was still ahead. Morning broke over the Ardennes with a bitter, metallic cold that cut through jackets and bit into exposed skin. The sky was a pale gray sheet, heavy with low clouds that promised more snow. Visibility was poor, perfect conditions for armored warfare in the twisted forests, where tanks could appear like phantoms and vanish just as quickly. The Americans had barely survived the night attack when new orders arrived. German armor advancing toward the ridge. Prepare for engagement. Captain Harris scanned the valley through binoculars. His breath fogged the lenses, forcing him to wipe them with trembling gloves. Below him, a column of American Shermans rumbled into position, engines growling in the cold air. Their olive-drab hulls were streaked with frozen mud, their crews exhausted but ready. "Panzer Division," Harris murmured as he lowered the binoculars. "They're really pushing everything they've got." Across the valley, faint smoke trails rose between the pines, German Panthers moving in formation. Sleek, powerful, deadly. Their long 75mm guns could pierce a Sherman from distances where American tanks couldn't even reply. The crews inside them were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal mechanized warfare. Today, they had come to punch a hole straight through the Allied line. The first explosion came without warning. A Panther fired from the far tree line, and the round slammed into the ground beside a Sherman, flipping snow into a towering cloud. The American tank jolted, but the shell ricocheted, leaving the crew stunned but alive. "Sherman 1, fire!" The reply was instant. The American tank's gun thundered, sending a shell screaming toward the Panther. It struck the German armor, but bounced harmlessly off. The German tank adjusted its aim, turret turning smoothly. Then all hell broke loose. Panthers and Shermans exchanged fire across the valley, each blast shaking the frozen earth. Flames burst from struck tanks, black smoke curling into the low sky. The valley became a battlefield of roaring engines, clattering treads, and the deafening crack of high-velocity shells. Lieutenant Burns Sherman moved up the left flank, weaving between blasted tree stumps. "Keep her steady!" Burns shouted as the loader slammed another shell into the breach. A German anti-tank gun hidden behind fallen timber fired, a flash, a crack, and Burns Sherman rocked violently. The shell tore through the side, spitting molten metal inside the cramped turret. The interior filled with smoke and screams. "Bail out! Bail out!" The crew flung themselves into the snow as the tank burned behind them. Machine gun fire stitched the ground around them, forcing them to crawl toward the ridge in a frantic scramble for survival. On the right flank, an American M10 tank destroyer positioned itself behind a shattered farmhouse. Its crew held their breath, waiting. A Panther rolled past their line of sight, unaware of the threat. "Fire!" The M10 recoiled, hurling a shell that slammed into the Panther's side armor. This time the shell penetrated, and flames burst from the turret. The Panther lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. But the victory was short-lived. Another Panther spotted the M10 and fired with ruthless precision. The tank destroyer erupted in an instant, a plume of fire and debris shooting skyward. The battle seesawed brutally. Artillery thundered from the American rear positions, shells slamming into the German advance. Snow geysers erupted across the forest floor. Panthers maneuvered, trying to flank the Shermans. American infantry fired bazookas from icy ditches. The valley shook under the fury of steel. At midday, the fighting reached its climax. Two Shermans crested a hill to face a Panther head-on at less than 200 yards. Both sides fired simultaneously. The Panther's shell blasted straight through the first Sherman, exploding out the rear. But the second Sherman's shot struck true, right under the German turret ring. The Panther exploded, turret flying upward in a fireball that lit the gray sky. Silence slowly crept back as smoking wrecks littered the valley floor. Flames crackled from destroyed tanks. The snow was churned into black mud, littered with debris, metal fragments, and the bodies of fallen crewmen. Captain Harris lowered his binoculars with a heavy sigh. "We held them," he said quietly. "But God, at what cost?" The steel giants had clashed, and the forest still trembled from the echoes. Tomorrow, the battle would shift again. But for today, the Americans had survived the deadliest armored engagement yet in the Ardennes. The sun dipped behind the dense Ardennes forest, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-covered battlefield. The roar of tank combat faded into distant echoes, replaced now by the low, haunting hum of wind threading through the treetops. But inside those trees, the real nightmare was only beginning. American infantry of the 99th Division moved cautiously between the towering pines, rifles raised, breath misting in the frigid air. The snow reached their shins, each step was slow, deliberate, silent. The enemy was somewhere ahead, but the forest swallowed sound and sight alike, turning every direction into a potential death trap. Sergeant Koenig signaled his squad to halt. He crouched beside a fallen tree, scanning the shadows. "Eyes up! They'll hit us from the flanks," he whispered. And they did. A sudden crack of a Kar 98 rifle shattered the silence. Snow burst beside an American rifleman as the sniper's bullet struck the ground inches from his helmet. Then came the German machine gun fire, MG-42 rounds screaming through the trees at a blistering 1,200 rounds per minute. The forest erupted into chaos. "Cover! Get to cover!" The Americans dove behind stumps, frozen logs, and shallow ditches carved by shellfire. Bullets shredded pine branches above their heads, raining splinters down like deadly hail. Corporal Mason crawled through the snow toward a wounded soldier screaming for help. As he reached him, mortar shells whistled overhead. "Down!" The explosion shook the earth, flinging snow into the air and rattling nerves already pushed to breaking. German infantry advanced through the trees with grim determination. Their white winter camouflage blended perfectly into the forest, making them appear like phantoms drifting between the pines. Grenades arced through the air, thudding into the snow before erupting into deadly bursts of metal. Sergeant Koenig spotted an enemy squad pushing the right flank. "Bazooka team, now!" The two-man American rocket team set up behind a boulder, shaking from cold and terror. They fired, the rocket streaked through the trees, hitting a German position and sending debris flying in all directions. The explosion shattered the momentum of the German push, giving the Americans a precious sliver of breathing room. Farther ahead, a German assault group charged with bayonets fixed, shouting through the biting cold. The Americans answered with a brutal volley. Rifles snapped. Bars spat fire. Shotguns roared at close range. The forest floor became a hell's cape, churned with smoke, blood, and frozen mud. But the Germans kept coming. Night deepened, and with it came freezing temperatures that cut through every layer of clothing. Breath turned to ice on scarf edges. Fingers went numb around rifle triggers. Even the sound of footsteps grew faint beneath a crust of frost forming on the snow. The Americans pushed deeper into the woods, clearing position after position. Every tree seemed to hide an enemy. Every ridge seemed ready to erupt in gunfire. Yet they fought on, driven by sheer instinct and the knowledge that retreat was not an option, not in this forest, not in this war. At midnight, the forest quieted again. Smoke drifted between the trees. Spent casings gleamed in the moonlight. The bodies of fallen soldiers, both American and German, lay half buried in the snow. Sergeant Koenig leaned against a tree, breath ragged. "Hold the line," he whispered to no one in particular. "Just hold it." The forest had become an inferno of gunfire and steel. And though the battle still raged elsewhere, the infantry now understood, this was the true heart of the Ardennes, dark, cold, merciless. And survival here relied on instinct, grit, and the faint hope that dawn might bring reinforcement, instead of another attack. By dawn the snowstorm had finally passed, revealing a world carved by destruction. Burned-out tanks lined the frozen road. Trees split by artillery fire leaned at unnatural angles. Smoke lingered like a ghostly fog over the shattered battlefield. But for the Americans holding the critical crossroads near Barrages de Freiture, the fight was far from over. Major Donnell surveyed the intersection, 4 roads meeting in the middle of a clearing bordered by dense forest. Whoever controlled this crossroads controlled movement across the northern sector. And the Germans knew it. "Enemy armor spotted!" a lookout called from a rooftop. Donnell raised his binoculars. Through drifting smoke he saw them, Panzer IVs and half-tracks emerging from the tree line, infantry marching behind them. The Germans were regrouping for a final push. "Everyone to positions," Donnell ordered. "This is their last attempt. We hold, no matter what." American engineers hurriedly reinforced makeshift barricades made of logs, destroyed vehicles, and sandbags frozen solid. Machine gun teams set up overlapping fields of fire. Mortar crews prepared shells stamped with frost. Tanks, only 2 Shermans left, took cover behind a collapsed barn, their barrels aimed at the road. Silence settled over the crossroads. Even the wind stood still. Then, the German assault began. A Panzer IV fired the opening shot. The shells slammed into an American truck, turning it into a fireball that heated the freezing air. German infantry surged forward while MG-42s on half-tracks raked the American positions with blistering streams of bullets. "Sherman 1, fire!" The first Sherman answered with a booming shot that struck a Panzer IV dead center, blowing open its turret. The German tank burned fiercely, black smoke twisting into the sky. But more were coming. Artillery shells screamed overhead, smashing into the American defenses. The ground convulsed beneath explosions. Snow and dirt rained down. Whole barricades were shredded in seconds. Mortar teams returned fire, dropping rounds into advancing German infantry. Dozens fell, but the momentum continued. The Germans were throwing everything at the crossroads. Sergeant Lewis fired a captured MG-42 from a window, its barrel glowing red. "Keep them back!" he yelled over the thunder of battle. A German squad tried to flank from the left. American paratroopers engaged them in brutal close combat among broken walls and snowy trenches. Bayonets clashed. Rifle butts cracked bones. Grenades detonated at arm's length. The crossroads became a maelstrom of smoke, flames, and screams. Then came the worst moment of all. A German Tiger tank appeared from the forest, massive, unstoppable, its armor thick enough to shrug off anything but a perfect shot. The Americans froze as its cannon swung toward the remaining Sherman. The Tiger fired. The Sherman exploded, flipping onto its side in a storm of fire and debris. The shockwave knocked men off their feet. Donnell shouted, "Anti-tank team, take it down!" 2 soldiers sprinted with a bazooka, slipping on ice, bullets snapping around them. They reached a wrecked jeep for cover, braced the weapon, aimed. A German machine gun cut down the loader instantly. The remaining soldier roared in desperation, fired the rocket alone. The bazooka round streaked across the clearing and struck the Tiger's track. The mighty tank lurched, stalled, and skidded sideways. "Hit again! Finish it!" Another rocket team crawled forward under fire. They aimed at the Tiger's rear armor. Fired. This time, the explosion tore through the engine compartment. Flames burst outward, and the Tiger finally went still. The Americans cheered, but too soon. German infantry stormed the right flank in a last furious charge. The Americans barely held. Machine guns overheated. Ammunition dwindled. Medics dragged the wounded through the snow while bullets snapped overhead. At last, distant engines echoed through the forest. Reinforcements. American armor from the 3rd Armored Division thundered into the clearing, firing as they advanced. German troops faltered, pulled back, then broke into full retreat. The final stand had succeeded. The crossroads remained in American hands. And as Major Donnell looked across the shattered battlefield, he understood the price of victory, measured not by ground gained, but by the men who had held long enough for help to arrive. The morning sky glowed a pale steel gray as the distant rumble of engines rolled across the snowy hills. The previous night's battles had left the Ardennes battered and burned, a landscape torn by artillery, scarred by tank treads, and silent with exhaustion. The crossroads had held, but the war in the Bulge was far from finished. All along the front, American forces tightened their lines. Reinforcements arrived in steady waves, fresh infantry companies, armored columns from Patton's Third Army, and artillery battalions eager to answer days of desperate radio calls. The tide was shifting, slowly, methodically, relentlessly. German units, once confident and surging with momentum, now struggled to hold positions amid dwindling fuel, freezing temperatures, and relentless Allied counterattacks. Their supply lines were shattered. Their tanks sat motionless on the roadside, abandoned or burned out husks. Their infantry was exhausted, frostbitten, and battered by losses. On the ridgelines south of the crossroads, American scouts observed columns of German soldiers moving through the forest, disorganized, stumbling, burdened by wounded comrades, and lacking the speed they once used to drive deep into Allied territory. "Looks like they're pulling back," one scout muttered through chattering teeth. "They don't have a choice," replied another. "We broke their spear." At noon, the American counteroffensive began in earnest. Sherman tanks moved forward in staggered columns, kicking up frozen chunks of earth as they advanced. Their turrets scanned the treeline, barrels steady, engines roaring with renewed purpose. Infantry moved alongside them, boots crunching through the snow, rifles raised, faces tense but determined. The Germans fought stubbornly. In the forests near Manhay and Log Lees, they formed desperate rearguard positions, machine gun nests hidden behind felled trees, sniper teams lurking among ruined farmhouses, and pockets of infantry clinging to frozen ridges. But their fire lacked the ferocity of earlier days. Ammunition was scarce. Their tanks were out of fuel. Their lines were stretched thin. Each American advance felt more like pushing against a collapsing wall than facing a full-strength enemy. At Log Lees, American armor surrounded the remnants of Kampfgruppe paper, once the spearhead of the German attack. Now they were stranded, their tanks drained of fuel, their supplies nearly gone. Panzer crews worked frantically to destroy their own vehicles so the Americans wouldn't capture them. Explosions echoed across the hills as German soldiers abandoned their tanks, sprinting into the woods under American artillery fire. The once feared Panther tanks burned brightly, flames licking the sky like torches marking the end of the offensive. In the north, British forces pushed into the Kampfgruppe's flank, squeezing the German escape routes closed. The sound of artillery became a constant drumbeat, pounding German positions until they broke apart. The Ardennes, which had seen so many ambushes and desperate stands, now became a trap for the attackers. Major Donnell and his men advanced through a forest still littered with the scars of their earlier defense. Burned-out vehicles lay half-buried in snowbanks. Trees were shredded by shrapnel. Bodies, American and German, lay still beneath white blankets of frost, reminders of the brutal days that had come before. The men spoke little as they marched. They only walked forward, one careful step at a time, knowing each mile brought them closer to pushing the enemy back across the Siegfried Line. American air power returned with devastating force once the skies cleared. Waves of P-47 Thunderbolts swooped over retreating German columns, unleashing rockets and machine gun fire. Trucks burst into flames. Artillery carriages shattered. German infantry scattered for cover but found little protection on the open roads. For the first time in days, the skies belonged to the Allies. By January, the German offensive had fully collapsed. The Ardennes offensive, the last major attack Germany could mount, crumbled under the combined weight of American resilience, British pressure, and massive Allied logistical strength. What was meant to split the Allied armies had instead drained the final reserves of Germany's war machine. On January 25, the Americans reached their original lines. The Bulge was erased. Major Donnell stood on a ridge overlooking the snow-covered valleys below. Smoke still curled from distant wreckage. The wind was sharp and bitter. But a sense of finality lingered in the air, a feeling that the worst was behind them, and that Germany had burned its last offensive flame in these frozen woods. "Hard fight," Sergeant Lewis murmured, stepping beside him. Donnell nodded. "The hardest I've seen. But we held." Far below, American and British columns continued their advance, pushing the enemy back toward their defenses inside Germany. The road to victory would still be long, still bloody, but the strategic momentum had shifted. and the courage shown in the Ardennes had ensured it. The Battle of the Bulge had ended. And with it, the German hope of turning the war's tide. The soldiers who survived would never forget the cold, the chaos, the desperation, or the unbreakable resolve forged in the snow-covered forest of the Ardennes.